Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code, is a publishing phenomenon, the kind that comes along perhaps once in a generation. But unlike other successful novels, this book has spawned as much criticism as critical acclaim. A murder mystery that revolves around the origins of Christianity, The Da Vinci Code is enlightening to some, disturbing to others. In the author's own words, these are topics that resonate at a deep, deep spiritual level. And indeed they do. But unlike other novelists, Dan Brown insists that the portrayals of the topics in his book are factual. Could it be, as one of the characters in the book states, almost everything our fathers taught us about Christ is false? Is it a fact that there was a conspiracy by early church fathers to cover up the true teachings of Christ? Did the followers of Jesus really believe him to be a mortal prophet? And was his divinity simply invented for the convenience of a 4th century Roman emperor? Do the works of Leonardo da Vinci hide cleverly coded information that somehow proves Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene? Are there secret organizations that were formed hundreds of years ago still functioning in the world around us? Did Leonardo da Vinci, Sir Isaac Newton, Botticelli, and other luminaries have a hand in protecting these secrets from being destroyed by the church? Has Dan Brown uncovered verifiable truths? Or has he simply discovered a clever way to sell a novel? Prepare yourself for a journey into the world of classical art, religion, mystery, and adventure as Breaking the Da Vinci Code investigates these and many other highly controversial questions raised by this confusing offering of fact and fiction.
The Da Vinci Code is unquestionably a runaway bestseller. It is, by all accounts, a fast-paced, well-crafted murder mystery full of enigmatic twists and turns designed to keep the reader glued to its pages until the last villainous character is caught, killed, or revealed. But there are several key elements of the author's thesis that jolt the reader right from the start. According to the book, Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene, and they had children, who eventually intermarried with the French line of royalty. And even more startling, the Christian church is said to have known this for centuries, but has kept the knowledge secret for fear of destroying their power. But what did Leonardo da Vinci have to do with all of this? And why has a novel, which by definition is fiction, spawned at least a dozen books criticizing its conclusions? Is Dan Brown's book truth? He claims to be married to an art historian, and implies that his book contains hidden truth, with every detail painstakingly researched. The situations and characters are made up, of course, but he insists the research on the religious organizations, architecture, history, and artwork is fully authentic. Our investigation begins in one of the world's great art museums. The Louvre in Paris is rightly regarded as one of the greatest repositories of classical art anywhere in the world, and it houses several works by the great Renaissance master, Leonardo da Vinci. Since this is the setting for the cold-blooded murder that opens Dan Brown's popular novel, let's first examine the basic premise of the story. The murder victim is the curator of this famed museum and, supposedly, the Grand Master of a centuries-old secret society known as the Priory of Sion. His killer is a burly albino who is a member of another shadowy religious sect called Opus Dei. Now, if you haven't read the book, don't worry, we're not giving away anything here. The mystery that surrounds this murder is not in trying to discover who did it, but why it was done. The murder and the murderer are, in fact, part of the opening scenes. But the victim lives just long enough to leave a set of enigmatic clues in the form of complex codes that the hero, Robert Langdon, an expert symbologist, and Sophie Neveu, the victim's granddaughter and a professional cryptographer, must figure out. The urgency of solving the riddle is enhanced when Langdon becomes the prime suspect in the murder. Now, we know, of course, that he didn't do it, but an increasingly complex sequence of clues brings the reader face to face with the hidden agenda of the Priory of Sion, the secret order which, among other things we are told, was the founder of the famous Knights Templar. Next, the reader must deal with several seemingly unrelated events, including the sinister motives of a committed leader of Opus Dei, ostensibly an arm of the Catholic Church, the political maneuverings of Constantine the Great, and an alleged love affair between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. All of that, of course, is fair game in a fictional novel, but according to the experts, this is where Dan Brown crosses the line.
If this novel were just fiction, it wouldn't be a problem, but the author has gone around the country saying it's nonfiction and everything's true. In fact, that he tried to disprove many of the things in the novel and became a believer.
What does Dan Brown himself have to say about it? Does he believe that the tales of secret societies and a secret marriage between Mary Magdalene and Jesus are true? We invited Mr. Brown to appear on our show, but he declined. He also refused permission for us to use video excerpts from previously broadcast interviews and personal appearances. But Dan Brown did explain his position during a television special viewed by millions. He said, quote, "I began as a skeptic. When I started researching the Da Vinci Code, I really thought that I would disprove a lot of the theory about Mary Magdalene and holy blood and all of that. I became a believer." But a believer in what? The marriage of Jesus to Mary Magdalene? The machinations of Opus Dei? The dark workings of the Priory of Sion? The power of Constantine to establish the divinity of Jesus Christ? Or all of the above?
What makes any critique of Dan Brown's book particularly disturbing is his deliberate attempt to pass on the view that it is based on fact. The reader is immediately confronted with a preliminary page declaring unequivocally the Priory of Zion, a European secret society founded in 1099, is a real organization. And on the same page we are also told the Vatican prelature known as Opus Dei is a deeply devout Catholic sect. And then this, all depictions of artwork, architecture, documents, and secret rituals in this novel are accurate. Mr. Brown gives himself very little leeway when he makes these assertions. The introductory presentation, which presents these so-called facts as foundational truths, takes the novel out of the realm of simply being a work of fiction.
Brown's assertions of fact are central to our investigation of his work, along with the reasons he gives to justify those assertions. Now, that being the case, let's examine each of them in detail. First, the Priory of Sion. Dan Brown insists it's a fact that the Priory of Sion is a European secret society founded in Jerusalem in 1099, and that in 1975, Paris's Bibliothèque Nationale discovered parchments known as les dossiers secrets, identifying numerous luminaries who were members of the Priory of Sion, including Sir Isaac Newton, Botticelli, Victor Hugo, and Leonardo da Vinci, thus tying Leonardo factually to this ancient secret order. And in the novel, this group is also given credit for establishing the powerful Knights Templar, who set up their headquarters here, on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and under the guise of protecting pilgrims to the Holy Land and with the blessing of the Pope, began amassing an enormous treasure and immense political power. Again, a presumption of fact is attributed to this idea. The next statement of fact has to do with something a little closer to our own time. Two of the principals in the Da Vinci Code, Silas, the albino murderer, and his mentor, Father Aaron Garosa, are said to be members of Opus Dei, a modern organization and therefore a group we can subject to closer scrutiny.
Opus Dei was founded on October 2nd of 1928. Its members are mostly lay members, with about 2% being priests. Opus Dei is Latin for Work of God, and it boasts about 80,000 members in 60 countries. Opus Dei has its headquarters in Rome, and in 1982, Pope John Paul II elected the organization to a personal prelature, and on October 6, 2002, it canonized its founder, José María Escrivá. And there is, in fact, a Opus Dei building at 243 Lexington Avenue in New York.
In this statement, Brown only establishes that there is indeed an Opus Dei building in New York. But the book takes his characterization much further. Does its very existence prove Brown's thesis that it is somehow connected to dark and nefarious activities? For that matter, is Opus Dei a secret society? Are there monks that hide in darkened rooms and flail themselves in sordid rituals? Is there a bishop of Opus Dei? And has the prelature been disassociated from the church? Were les dossiers secrets really discovered? And if so, were they authentic? We'll see if we can discover the answer to these questions. And we'll see if we can determine if the final statement of fact, boldly stated in the front of the book, which says, all descriptions of architecture, documents, and secret rituals in this novel are accurate, is itself accurate. By using the world-famous painting of The Last Supper as a literary device, the author brings Leonardo da Vinci into the plot, again with the presumption that what the reader is being told is, at the very least, accurate.
All these so-called facts of Dan Brown center on Mary Magdalene specifically. In fact, he goes on to say that she's the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail is not a thing or a chalice, according to Dan Brown. It's a person. He actually says it's the womb of Mary Magdalene, but by extension, Mary Magdalene herself. She goes on, according to Dan Brown, to become the mother of the official bloodline of Jesus Christ. Well, this dynasty goes on to become, according to Brown, the Merovingian line of the kings of France, which are eventually driven underground. Well, supposedly there is this secret society called the Priory of Sion. The murder victim in the book is the last Grand Master of the Priory of Sion. Robert Langdon's task then, as the hero of the book, is to solve this, or this great piece of information will be lost forever.
So, there we have the dilemma. What is fact and what is fiction? Will all of these facts, will any of these facts hold up under closer scrutiny? Was there a Priory of Sion in 1099? Did they establish the Knights Templar as their military arm? Is it possible that Mary Magdalene was married to Jesus, and did she hold a preeminent place among the apostles? And does this painting, Leonardo da Vinci's famous The Last Supper, hold a secret code that proves the Mary Magdalene theory? Dan Brown isn't the first author to write about some kind of an affair between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. In fact, much of the information in Brown's book parallels the information in the 1983 publication Holy Blood, Holy Grail. The authors of this book, which they claim is a non-fictional study of religious history, have recently filed a breach of copyright lawsuit in Great Britain against the publishers of Brown's book, claiming theft of intellectual property. And another author, Louis Perdue, thinks the facts in the Da Vinci Code are much too close to the fiction he wrote in his two books, The Da Vinci Legacy, also published in 1983, and The Daughter of God, published in 2000.
When I first read the Da Vinci Code, it wasn't the massive similarities that truly bothered me, but what I found was there were mistakes that I'm the only person who made were replicated in the Da Vinci Code. For example, when I wrote the Da Vinci Legacy, I made a mistake and wrote that Leonardo's Codex Leicester was written on parchment, but the only other place on the planet that appears is in Brown's Da Vinci Code. And there are other things. For example, I have female spiritual characters that the heroine is related to just as Brown does. In both the Da Vinci Legacy and the Da Vinci Code, the fourth art expert of his type is murdered. He leaves his last message written in his own blood, on his own body, And in both books, they take place on page 35. And there are other things. In both books, a murdered curator leaves a unique gold key to the heroine inside a wood-painted work of art which refers to a holy woman. This gold key, which turns no lock, leads to a Zurich Bank safe deposit box containing yet another container locked by a combination and containing very important secrets. If I hadn't written The Da Vinci Legacy 20 years before the Da Vinci Code came out, I would have thought I got all my ideas from Brown.
For his part, Brown says he's never heard of Louis Perdue, nor had any knowledge of his work. In any event, since the Da Vinci Code is not simply based on some actual event or series of events, rather the story develops out of these so-called facts, these facts become extremely critical to the integrity of the book, especially when the characters, all of them unquestionably fictitious, move through the story revealing secrets that other historians, art experts, and scientists have apparently, according to Brown, been hiding from the world. If the book is fact, doesn't it bring into question the integrity of these noted experts? But it's in the novel's portrayal of Mary Magdalene that the lines are most blurred. Mary Magdalene is portrayed in the novel as the very elect of all the followers of Jesus, and, in fact, his wife.
There's absolutely no historical evidence whatsoever that Jesus was married. From both a biblical and a historical perspective, there's no evidence and no credibility for that perspective.
The primary offense, among many, is the novel's trumpeting the Magdalene heresy. This clearly is the central issue. Legends about Jesus and Mary Magdalene began to emerge in southern France in the 9th century. Some even linking Mary Magdalene with the pagan goddess Isis. Brown's novel attempts to support these outrageous notions by allusions from the Gnostic Gospels.
There's not a shred of evidence that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene. To come up with that kind of a theory, you have to just appeal to any kind of overactive imagination, because in terms of historical record, we have none.
Liberal and conservative scholars of Jesus agree that there is no evidence that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene. I tell my classes that when liberals and conservatives agree, it's probably right.
It's easy to say that a reader should approach this book as just a novel, and I'm in complete agreement with that. The problem, though, is that the way that Dan Brown has written the book indicates that the readers should actually take the historical assertions, the assertions about art, as factual, when in fact they are not. And these assertions are really angering the historical community in a very important way. And it's also important because millions of people are reading this to get information about religion, art, and history. And the fact is, it would be much better if they would only take it as a novel.
The Gospel record does paint a picture of a Mary that is devoted to Jesus. She follows him from Galilee, ministers to him, watches the crucifixion, stands at the foot of the cross, watches over the tomb, and is the first to see the risen Lord. It's Mary Magdalene who reports the resurrection to the disciples, thus becoming the apostle to the apostles. But since there's no explicit text about the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the novelist turns to another source. Could it be, as Brown insists, that Leonardo da Vinci, as Grand Master of the Priory of Sion, knew the secret and painted clues to the mystery here, in one of his most famous paintings?
Leonardo da Vinci was in the service of the Duke of Milan, and the Duke commissioned him to do a painting of the Last Supper, which was to be hung in the monastery in the city of Santa Maria delle Grazie. And the purpose was so that the friars would have something pleasing to look at while they were eating. In the novel, we are told that Leonardo, who was actually in on the secret, actually painted Mary Magdalene and not John the Apostle to the right of Jesus. Now, this is very important, of immense importance, as a matter of fact, in understanding the Da Vinci Code. The implication is that Leonardo did not just simply paint a pretty picture of the Last Supper. It was his way of telling the world something of immense importance.
In Dan Brown's novel, The Last Supper is a fresco portraying Jesus at the moment of consecration when he is saying, "This is my body, this is my blood." And Mary Magdalene is seated at his right-hand side, thereby proclaiming to the world that she is not only favored, but is actually the Holy Grail. Well, this is completely at odds with what Leonardo himself tells us in his work, The Treatise on Painting. You see, Leonardo builds his paintings according to visual types. Now, there are several dozen types available for visual representation, and the student type was prominent among these. Now, John, the apostle, is the youngest of the disciples, and he is also the disciple that Jesus loved. So John is invariably represented as the student. The student has long hair. He has no beard because he's too young to grow a decent beard. He's inexperienced. He's hanging on the master's every word. Da Vinci did not depict Mary Magdalene. He depicted St. John the Apostle. In fact, it would be difficult to find an art historian who would agree with Dan Brown's theory. Art historians know that this theory is silly. And to be quite blunt, they are not willing to trade public fame for professional ridicule.
Keep in mind that a reading of the Last Supper as an iconographic message about the relationship of Jesus and Mary Magdalene is totally dependent on Leonardo's being a Grand Master of the Priory of Sion. Would Leonardo have had the freedom to reinterpret Scripture to suit his own ideas?
During the Renaissance, an artist would be given a commission, and within that commission he would be given a lot of free rein, but also he would have specific guidelines that he would have to follow, and we can presume that Leonardo followed those guidelines.
What Leonardo was portraying here was not the moment of consecration. It was the moment of betrayal, when the apostles are proclaiming that they will never abandon or betray Jesus Christ. Judas, Peter, and John are grouped together because they show the three reactions to Christ. Judas betrays Christ and never returns. Peter abandons Christ, but he does return. John is the only one who never abandons or betrays Jesus Christ. And this explains why everyone still has their own cup. This painting was simply not about the establishment of the Eucharist. Now, there is one more error in Dan Brown's interpretation. It's an error that most researchers would not catch, but any art historian would. The Last Supper is not a fresco, which is, in its simplest terms, paint mixed with plaster. Rather, it is tempera painted on stone or a dry wall, which accounts for its massive deterioration in just a few years after it was painted. After many attempts to restore and save the Last Supper, it is almost certain that nothing of what Leonardo originally put on that wall is still there.
But why go to such great lengths to place Mary Magdalene in the painting if modern scholarship regards the idea as silly? Just who is Mary Magdalene, and why is she so important to the Da Vinci Code? At a literary luncheon shortly after the release of the book, Brown explained that it was a college professor who first made him aware of Mary Magdalene's appearance in the Last Supper. According to Brown, the professor told him, "If you look on the right hand of Jesus, there is the Holy Grail, and her name is Mary Magdalene." For centuries, the Grail legend has centered around the cup of the Last Supper, the sacramental cup containing the wine Jesus referred to as his blood. The search for this cup, or Holy Grail, is believed by many to be the source of the legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. So how does Mary Magdalene become the Holy Grail?
First of all, we need to understand that Leonardo's portrayal confirms other Florentine depictions, stressing the sacrifice and the betrayal rather than the Eucharist and the chalice. So Brown is wrong here in his interpretation of Leonardo's wonderful painting of the Lord's Supper. In fact, according to art experts, virtually everything that Dan Brown says about Leonardo is wrong. The so-called evidence that Mary Magdalene is actually the chalice, the cup that bore the blood of Christ, is really just based on fanciful speculation. In about the 15th century, the idea developed that the Holy Grail was not a vessel, but a family tree. Specifically, in the Da Vinci Code, the Holy Grail is the sang real, that is to say, the bloodline of Jesus. And Mary Magdalene continued that bloodline by bearing his child, and she, in effect, became the vessel of the blood of Christ.
And once again, lacking any textual or historic support, Dan Brown turns to the painting of the Last Supper for confirmation of this idea by noting that the inward side of the symbolic M actually forms a V, which, according to Brown, is a symbol of, quote, the womb in its very strict symbolic sense.
There is general agreement that Mary Magdalene was special. If for no other reason, the fact is that she was the first to see the risen Christ. And that in itself would set her apart from the other 5 Marys mentioned in the Gospels. And if she did bear the child of Jesus, they most assuredly would have been married. Unfortunately for this theory, there's absolutely no evidence for a marriage or a child. And certainly no agreement among art experts regarding Dan Brown's theory that Leonardo painted Mary Magdalene and not John the Apostle sitting next to Jesus in that great masterpiece of the Lord's Supper.
And fortunately, we don't have to resort to fanciful speculation, nor do we have to accept the notions of some art history professor. Leonardo himself gave us the answer.
He did a lot of preliminary sketches to get his composition, and we have some of those sketches where the apostles are labeled. That's another way we know that it's not Mary Magdalene sitting next to Jesus, it is the apostle St. John.
Still, there's a very strong tradition in France that Mary Magdalene did come to the southern part of that country with Joseph of Arimathea following the crucifixion, where she bore a child, a daughter named Sarah. And according to the characters in the Da Vinci Code, there's proof of the marriage, found in the Gnostic Gospels, most of which were discovered in Egypt, and in the Dossier Secret, discovered in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, both in the last half of the 20th century. But what secrets are in those secret files? And what exactly are the Gnostic Gospels? Are they authentic Gospels? Are they accepted as canon by any church or religion? As a murder mystery, there is something quite different at work in the Da Vinci Code. Instead of clues helping to solve the murder is merely a device that permits the author to elaborate on the clues. Still trying to elude the police, the symbologist and the cryptographer stumble upon an old acquaintance of the American, a British expert and fanatical pursuer of the Holy Grail named Teabing. It is this character that casts Mary Magdalene in the role of the Grail itself, not just the possessor of the precious cup, but the actual vessel. How does this fit with the more conventional Grail legends?
Well, the Holy Grail has generally been perceived as a cup or a chalice that was used at the Last Supper. It has even expanded to mean sometimes a platter, sometimes a cauldron, and in the Middle Ages, the myth expanded enormously. Such things as a sword, a spear, a lance, all types of things were added to this unusual legend. But normally it was seen as the cup or the chalice that was used by Christ at the Last Supper. What Dan Brown does is add a whole new dimension. He changes the whole concept of the Holy Grail from some item or some object to the person of Mary Magdalene specifically. And to try to bolster that, he begins to draw from the Gnostic Gospels.
The 20th century was host to the greatest discovery of ancient documents in history. The Dead Sea Scrolls startled the scholarly world with tens of thousands of documents and document fragments paralleling Old Testament writings. But even before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, a treasury of ancient texts relating to the New Testament was unearthed near the town of Nag Hammadi in Egypt. These texts contained what has become known as the Gnostic Gospels. But what exactly are they? And how do they differ from the New Testament?
In Nag Hammadi, there were unearthed several Gospels, 4 or 5, that are not in the Bible and that are a part of this Gnostic sect. Gnosticism was a combination of Christianity and Greek philosophy. These Gospels have a completely different theology than what we have in the New Testament, and that's the reason they were never accepted into the New Testament. The novels claim that these Gospels were part of 80 Gospels and that the 4 that we have were chosen out of them is completely false.
Gnosticism acquired its name from the Greek term for knowledge, gnosis, and there is, in fact, a Gnostic Bible available at many bookstores. Among its contents can be found the Gospels, discovered near Nag Hammadi in Egypt.
Here we have to call some of the characters of the Da Vinci Code into account, because we're told that in concealing the truth about the marriage of Jesus Christ to Mary Magdalene, according to Brown, the Church has engaged in, quote, the greatest cover-up in human history. It is the Gnostic Gospels that supposedly provide the evidence. But what do they really say? The Gospel of Philip says that the companion of Jesus was Mary of Magdala, and he loved her more than his other students. And then Dan Brown says that he kissed her often on the mouth. As a practical matter, the manuscripts have some words missing. For example, in this case it says that Jesus kissed her often on the, and then it's blank. Now Dan Brown fills that in by saying he kissed her often on the mouth. But perhaps it read on the forehead or maybe even on the hand. In any event, this account says nothing about marriage. Then there is the word companion, which according to Brown is the real clincher. Because he says, as any Aramaic scholar will tell you, that word companion means spouse. There are 2 problems here. First of all, the account did not come to us in Aramaic, but in Coptic. And secondly, that word companion in either language really does refer to a friendship or a friend. By no means does it always refer to marriage.
Later in the novel, the Gospel of Mary is quoted to show that it was Jesus' intention for Mary Magdalene to become the leader of the church, a sort of divine goddess. And here too, the suggestion is made that these writings have as much value as the New Testament Gospels and other historical documents. But is that true? Could it be that except for the intervention of a pagan emperor named Constantine, Mary Magdalene might have become a goddess and the embodiment of something called the sacred feminine?
Brown supports these outrageous notions by allusions to the Gnostic Gospels, which make no reference that support any of his contentions. But even if they did, it'd be irrelevant. They were written 2 centuries after the Gospel period by someone posing as someone he wasn't. No genuine scholar can regard them as having any historical merit.
On page 235 of the Da Vinci Code, T. Bing, the book's theological expert, states, "Almost everything our fathers taught us about Christ is false. And it is Constantine and the Council of Nicaea that are held up as the perpetrators of all the lies. We are told that it was only by a vote of the bishops assembled at Nicaea that Jesus was made the Son of God, and by a relatively close vote at that. Is Christianity, as we know it, really a creation of the 4th century, not the 1st?
Constantine certainly was an important figure in early Christian history. The church went from being persecuted by the empire to being received and endorsed by the emperor. This brought significant changes to the early church, but they were not as great as the novel suggests.
Church historians agree that next to the events in the New Testament, the most important event in the history of Christianity is the conversion of the Emperor Constantine in 312. What was the great event that converted Constantine in the first place? And is there any evidence to suggest he actually took ecclesiastical control?
According to the ecclesiastical historian Eusebius, Constantine was preparing to attack Rome and praying to a pagan god when he saw a cross in the heavens with an inscription, "Conquer by this." Then in his sleep, the Christ of God appeared to him with the same sign and commanded him to make a likeness of the sign to carry against all engagements with the enemy. He did as instructed, and his army won. Constantine became emperor and issued the Edict of Toleration, which meant Christians would no longer be persecuted. But even here, Brown's distortion of history is evident. It was not Constantine who made Christianity the state religion. He simply granted freedom of worship in 313. It was later that Theodosius made Christianity the state religion in 381.
Within a few years, doctrinal disputes began tearing the kingdom apart. Constantine, embarrassed by the uproar over his new religion, convened the first ecumenical council of church leaders in Nicaea. Over 300 bishops met and, among other things, developed what became known as the Nicene Creed. However, according to the Da Vinci Code, the doctrine of Christ's deity was the center of the debate and passed the council by a relatively close vote.
The statement by Dan Brown that this passed only by a very close vote is pure fiction. Of the 318 bishops, only 5 at the Council of Nicaea had qualms about the final decision, and when it came down to the final vote, only 2 voted against it. Now that's hardly a cliffhanger. In any case, Constantine really didn't care about the finer points of theology, so long as it unified his subjects. In fact, the emperor gave the opening speech at the Council of Nicaea himself, and he said that doctrinal disunity was even worse than war.
Then there's the matter of the Bible itself. Once again, according to the storyline in Brown's book, it was the emperor who approved which books did and did not become sacred canon. Was it Constantine who controlled such a profound decision as to which of the Gospels would be included in the Bible and which were to be omitted?
In fact, try as they might, scholars have not been able to find one line in the proceedings of the Council of Nicaea, which are still in existence, that refer to which book should be in the Bible or which should not. They were discussing mainly the origin of Christ and so forth, whether he was co-eternal with the Father, and there is simply not one indication whatever that they discussed the canon.
It's not as if it's a big secret or a raging controversy of how we got the New Testament. Every New Testament book was cited as authoritative by a church father within a single generation after Christ's death and his resurrection. And all 27 books were accepted before the end of the first century.
Is it only in the history of Christianity where fact and fiction become confused? Does anyone accept the Gnostic Gospels as reliable guides to the history of the New Testament? Can scholars and historians verify the connection between Leonardo da Vinci and the Priory of Sion? To this point, the Da Vinci Code leaves the reader with a rather tortured view of the first 300 years of Christianity. According to Brown's characters, Christians were just a small, troublesome sect following the teachings of a man who was crucified. They were thereafter guided by other men who were prepared to lie to cover up the real teachings of Christ in order to create positions of power for themselves. Is it possible that church leaders really didn't believe in the divinity of Jesus until Constantine came along and declared him divine by royal edict?
Again, the Da Vinci Code is broken and found wanting. The claim that Jesus' divinity came from a vote at Nicaea some 300 years after the time of Jesus is just wrong. We can look back to Jesus' own response to the high priest that got him crucified. He claimed he would be seated at the right hand of the Father. This is a claim tantamount to claiming deity, and it predates Nicaea by about 300 years. This theology comes from Jesus himself and not from the Council of Nicaea.
But according to the Da Vinci Code, until that moment in history when Constantine deified Christ by royal edict, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless, a mortal.
We have important, non-Christian, extra-biblical evidence that Jesus was worshipped in the early 2nd century. Pliny, a governor, wrote to the Emperor Trajan in the 2nd decade of the 2nd century that Christians were worshiping Jesus as God. Now Pliny had no axe to grind. He was a non-Christian simply describing what was taking place. So this is an important piece of evidence. It's also corroborated by things that the Church Fathers wrote about Jesus, people like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, who also made it clear they viewed Jesus as divine. This is 200 years before Nicaea and shows that Nicaea is not responsible for creating the divinity of Jesus.
The Da Vinci Code, it seems, simply ignores the existing documents written in and around New Testament times. But let's get back to the recurring theme of the book, the great secret that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married. If that were true, surely she would have been in a favored position among his followers. Is there anything to suggest that this was the case?
In the Gnostic Gospel of Mary, Mary Magdalene is described as having a special revelation given to her by the Savior. At Peter's request, she tells the other disciples about this special revelation, and Peter says, are we to turn and listen to her? Does he prefer her to us? But Levi steps in saying, if the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? This story is about as close as you can get to giving preeminence to Mary Magdalene. But in reality, the Gnostics simply used her to give further legitimacy to some of their notions and doctrines.
Here too, Da Vinci Code focuses on several of Leonardo's paintings to prove that the artist was a member of the Priory of Zion, a goddess worshipper, and that he encoded cryptic messages into his paintings. In this context, the Mona Lisa, arguably the world's most famous painting, is an enigma. It's a symbol, but of what?
Dan Brown claims that the Mona Lisa is neither male nor female, but carries a subtle message of androgyny. He further suggests that the name Mona Lisa comes from two Egyptian gods, Ammon and the goddess Isis. Mona Lisa, Brown assures us, is an anagram of the divine union of male and female. Mr. Brown's assertions of accuracy once again fall before modern scholarship.
The Mona Lisa means whatever you want it to mean. The Mona Lisa may be a portrait of a Florentine lady named Mona Lisa Gioconda, or it's a portrait of Leonardo's mother, or it's his idea of the ideal woman. But he did not attach the name Mona Lisa to the painting. That comes much later with his biographer, Vasari.
The entire association of Leonardo da Vinci with what many scholars are calling religious heresies is predicated upon his being another in a long line of grand masters of the Priory of Zion. Another fact the reader is urged to accept. Sir Isaac Newton is also said to be a member of the Priory, but according to scholars, historians, and theologians, there's no evidence of either Leonardo da Vinci or Newton being involved with any secret religious organization.
Isaac Newton left thousands of pages behind which we have today, many of them dealing with the subject of religion. And he was looking in the Bible for some sort of code, but why in all these writings is there no mention whatever of any Da Vinci type code or any hint of the Priory of Zion?
According to Dan Brown, the Priory of Zion was founded in 1099 by the King of France and eventually developed a military arm, starting with 9 knights originally and then expanding eventually to what's known as the Knights Templar. Their assignment, according to Brown's theory, is to go to the Holy City and go through the ruins of the temple and try to discover all the documents pertaining to Mary Magdalene. Well, as it turns out, the Priory of Zion was actually founded in 1956, about 1,000 years after Dan Brown claims, by a very controversial and bizarre figure by the name of Pierre Plantard, an anti-Semite who had a criminal history. It's from his spurious writings that Dan Brown draws his theories. According to the author, the Priory of Zion was firmly established when papers were discovered in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, which listed, allegedly, the names of all the Grand Masters of this organization. These papers, which became known as Les Dossiers Secrets, or the secret records, did include certain names like Botticelli, Victor Hugo, Isaac Newton, and Leonardo da Vinci. These documents were actually planted there by Pierre Plantard. One of his henchmen even admitted participating in this hoax, along with planting the list of the alleged grand masters of the Priory of Sion. This has been the discussion of many French books, including a BBC documentary in 1996. What is amazing is that Dan Brown did not seem to know that.
But if there is no Priory of Sion, at least in the sense described in Dan Brown's book, what about Opus Dei? What do we know of this secret society?
They are not a secret organization as Brown makes them out, and they certainly do not have hulking albino assassins, and they are most particularly not monks. They're all lay people. Opus Dei is a legitimate, chartered organization of the Roman Catholic Church. It was founded by Saint Jose Maria Escrivá in the 1940s in Spain. Opus Dei is no more sinister than InterVarsity Fellowship or the Promise Keepers. It's trying to teach people how to live a holier life in the world in their vocation.
Historically, there was, however, a very powerful military and ecclesiastical group known as the Knights Templar. Since they couldn't have had anything to do with the Priory of Sion, who were they? And what role did they play?
The Knights Templar, of course, are well known. They were a crusading order, and supposedly they were dealing with the quest of the Holy Grail, and they were concerned with the documents, the secret documents testifying to the fact, supposedly, that Jesus married Mary Magdalene and they had a child. Initially, however, the real Knights Templar simply vowed to defend the roads to the Holy Land for the benefit of the new pilgrims who flocked to Jerusalem from all over Europe, and they sort of served as the travel agency, you might say, for the pilgrims of that time. They were in great favor with the church and actually set up their historic headquarters in Jerusalem near the Dome of the Rock, and from there they administered vast holdings in Europe and the Holy Land. The Templars constructed a number of fortresses and churches, many of which are still in use, like the Temple Church in London, and according to Brown's book, the Rosslyn Chapel, two of the key settings for the mystery near the close of the book.
The Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland is the place where the mystery ends. It's unquestionably a beautiful and unique church, but did the Knights Templar really build it? Are there still other historic and religious anomalies to be uncovered in the Da Vinci Code? With the popularity of the book and the willingness of many readers to accept its claims as fact, has Dan Brown dealt Christianity a damaging blow? Or does his book actually confirm the teachings of the Bible? Here, in the beautiful Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, the mystery of the Da Vinci Code comes to an end with the discovery of a six-pointed star surreptitiously embedded in the floor of the chapel. Once again, that fact turns out to be something less than factual.
Welcome to Rosslyn Chapel. The chapel was founded in 1446 by Sir William Sinclair. Dan Brown tells us that Rosslyn Chapel was founded and built by the Knights Templar. But this isn't true. The Knights Templar have nothing to do with Rosslyn Chapel. Dan Brown tells us that there's a six-pointed star worn into the floor at Rosslyn Chapel. This would be known as the Star of David or Solomon's Seal. Now this star would actually be very large. He says that it's worn between some of the most important things in the chapel, including the apprentice pillar over there. It would run right down here, right across there. Now, you don't usually get to look under the carpets at Rosslyn, but we thought we'd let you have a little look. As you can see, there is no sign of a six-pointed star or any pathways. This was completely invented by Dan Brown.
Dan Brown's characters are admittedly fictional, as is the plot and subplot of his mystery. The problems all arise from his claims that certain elements of the story are fact, and that all descriptions of artwork, architecture, documents, and secret rituals in this novel are accurate. The constraints of time make it impossible to deal with anything other than the main themes of the book in any length, but many of his more obscure claims deserve consideration as well. The matter of architecture, for example.
The Da Vinci Code's excursion into Gothic architecture claims that the Knights Templar designed female sexual symbolism into the great cathedrals to honor goddess worship. But that's nonsense. The typical Gothic cathedral is rectangular or cross-shaped. It is not shaped like a womb, and its design is derived from Roman public buildings, not from pagan temples. There's an implausible scene at the beginning of the Da Vinci Code which shows you how far Dan Brown is removed from reality. Sophie, the heroine, who is the granddaughter of the murder victim, yanks Leonardo's Madonna of the Rocks off the wall, slews it around, and holds it as a shield, knowing that the policeman will not fire at the valuable painting. The problem with this is that the painting is very large in a massive wooden frame. Brown tells you that it's 5 feet high. He tells you twice that it's 5 feet high, but it's actually 6.5 feet high. There's no way in that massive frame weighing between 250 and 300 pounds that this could be maneuvered. To take it a step further, Brown also tells his readers that nuns at the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception had commissioned the painting and specified its details. Small problem. The confraternity was composed of men, entirely of men, most of them laymen.
Biblical scholars, historians, researchers, artisans, and architects have been aware of the Magdalene mythology for many years. Why the sudden popularity? Perhaps being tucked away in the fictional history of a novel makes it more difficult to examine, and therefore more difficult to refute.
Detailing all of the errors, misrepresentations, deceptions, distortions, and outright falsehoods in the Da Vinci Code makes one wonder if his purpose in writing this novel in the first place was not just an exercise in bashing the church. Why load up an otherwise highly entertaining novel with the statements and assertions that anger a vast segment of the audience? Unless, of course, that was his intention to begin with.
If that was Brown's intention, he has certainly succeeded. Here are a few more items from the book that seem to have enraged various scholars the most.
The early Jewish tradition involved ritualistic sex, in the temple no less. Early Jews believed that the Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple housed not only God, but also his powerful female equal Shekinah.
This atrocious claim is really based on fantasy rather than fact. Nothing was more foundational to Judaism than the belief in one God and only one, and he did not have a female counterpart. As a matter of fact, the idea of attaching sexuality to deity was so abhorrent to the Hebrews that the language doesn't even have a word for goddess.
The Jewish tetragrammaton, Yahweh, the sacred name of God, in fact derived from Jehovah, an androgynous physical union between the masculine Yah and the pre-Hebraic name for Eve, Hava.
That is false in its entirety. Yahweh was the original name for God, which reflects the Hebrew verb to be. But since tradition forbid the verbal pronunciation of the name, rabbis in the 16th century pronounced the consonants Yad-He, Vad-He with the vowels of Adonai, or Lord, resulting in Jehovah. This all has nothing to do with any androgynous union.
The Bible has evolved through countless translations, additions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book.
This is totally misleading. The only changes that have ever taken place in the Bible throughout the centuries are an ever more faithful rendering and translation of the original Hebrew and the original Greek of the New Testament, without any additions to the text. In fact, there are scribes who devoted their entire life to the preservation of the originals, copying them, preserving them, letter by letter.
Fortunately for historians, some of the Gospels that Constantine attempted to eradicate managed to survive. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the 1950s, hidden in a cave near Qumran in the Judean desert.
So here we have three serious errors in just 3 lines. Constantine, for example, had nothing to do with the eradication of the gospel, or the confirming of the gospels for that matter. Secondly, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, not in the 1950s. And thirdly, the Dead Sea Scrolls have nothing to do with the gospels or anything about the life of Christ. These are bizarre errors when you consider the fact that it's claimed that the book was meticulously researched.
Virtually every claim relating to Christianity in Dan Brown's book has been challenged at some level. But it is Leonardo da Vinci who suffers most, since he is portrayed as the main perpetrator of these stories through the secret manipulation of his art. Is there any possibility that this was the focus of his work after all?
Leonardo himself was not interested in the occult. He made fun of alchemy. He perhaps had doubts about religion at times because the church was very corrupt in his day, which is the 15th and 16th centuries. But he did not abandon Christianity. At the end of his life, he received the last sacraments of the church and he made arrangements for a proper Christian funeral.
In Leonardo's will, dictated before witnesses, the artist commends his soul to Almighty God, not the goddess, to the Blessed Virgin Mary, not Mary Magdalene, and to Saint Michael and all the saints and angels in paradise. That hardly sounds like a man with an affinity for goddesses.
Halfway through the book, all this terrible misinformation begins. Now, I'm not trying to say this isn't a fun read. Of course it's a fun read, but that's the problem. The poison is carefully included in a very delicious morsel, and that makes it really almost diabolical.
It is, in fact, one of the most badly researched pieces of writing I have ever encountered in my life.
The problem with Dan Brown's writing is it's a blend of a little bit of fact and a whole lot of fiction in such a way that the reader can't sort out which is which.
As an author, Dan Brown is reaping the rich rewards of his highly successful work, and he is keenly aware of the stir it has caused among both historians and theologians.
Near the end of an extensive television interview, Dan Brown explained his position in these words, quote, "The mystery of spirituality, the Holy Grail, the origins of our religions, these are topics that resonate at a deep, deep spiritual level, really at the core of the human psyche. And whether you agree or disagree with the topics, they're on the table, and we're talking about them. And these are topics that for centuries have been taboo," unquote.
That's all well and good, but the issue isn't just religion. It's fact versus fiction, truth versus lies, accuracy versus inaccuracy. The Da Vinci Code would be no less onerous if its misrepresentations were used to denigrate any world religion. However, the Da Vinci Code seems dedicated to gross misrepresentation of that religious faith that hundreds of millions of people hold sacred.
I think that what we've seen is that Dan Brown got both the theology and the art history wrong. In fact, his piece of fiction, which he claimed was nonfiction, is in fact some of the best fiction of his book.
If there is any good that has come out of the Da Vinci Code phenomenon, it is that it has stimulated a lot of questions about important matters. Who is Jesus and what is early Christianity all about? Any negative effect lies in the fact that in all of the talk about Jesus being married to Mary Magdalene, references to the sacred divine feminine, or what Dan Brown calls the real story. Fact is that in the midst of this, the real story is lost.
The popularity of the novel might possibly have opened meaningful and constructive discussions regarding the foundations of the Christian faith and the reality of just who Jesus Christ really is. However, many experts are asking an obvious question. Is it wise or even logical to turn to a novelist with an agenda for instruction in matters of faith? There are many other aspects of the Da Vinci Code our experts would have liked to discuss with you, but there just wasn't time. However, if you have a question that wasn't answered, you can go to the websites listed here and browse to your heart's and mind's content. The truth. The real truth is available to all of us, quite possibly already on a shelf in your library. As for the Da Vinci Code, it should be read and enjoyed for what it is, a compelling work of fiction.